The gold medal is under her bed, has been for 3 years. She cleans floors now, mops the same mat where tonight a black belt instructor just told a deaf child he doesn't belong here. 9 months she's been invisible in this building. 9 months of watching, saying nothing, being no one. Then he turns to her, laughs, points at her mop like it explains everything about who she is and what she's worth, says, "Come on, show me what you've got." 30 seconds later, a third-degree black belt is flat on his back, staring at the ceiling, and the woman holding his arm in a perfect lock. Just lets go. The medal was heavier than she remembered. Zara Coleman stood in front of the bathroom mirror at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, holding it in both hands. Not looking at it. Looking at her hands instead. The calluses were still there. Thick ridges across her palms, across her knuckles. The kind that don't go away no matter how many years you spend holding a mop instead of a gi. The kind that remember what they were made for, even when the rest of has decided to forget. She set the medal on the edge of the sink, looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then put it back in the wooden box, closed the lid, walked to the bedroom, and to push the box under the bed with her foot. The way you'd push something out of sight when you're not ready to throw it away, but can't stand to look at it either. Then she turned off the light and went to sleep like a woman with nothing to remember. The alarm went off at 5:15. Not because she needed it to. Zara hadn't slept past 5 in 11 years. The body remembers training schedules long after the mind decides it's done with them. Long after the mind packs up and moves somewhere quieter and smaller and easier to survive in, the body keeps the old clock running. Keeps waking up at 5:15 like it's still waiting for something that isn't coming anymore. She made coffee. Black, 2 cups, stood at the kitchen window of her apartment on the east side of Atlanta and watched the city come back to life, slowly, reluctantly, the way Atlanta always woke up, like it had somewhere to be but wasn't sure it wanted to go there. The apartment was small, clean, almost aggressively bare. No art on the walls, no throw pillows on the couch, no plants on the windowsill. Nothing that said someone lived here with any particular feeling about it. The furniture was second-hand and functional. The kitchen table had 1 chair. The bookshelf held library books, all of them with the small white stickers on the spine that meant they belonged to someone else and would have to go back eventually. Everything in Zara Coleman's life had to go back eventually, except for one thing. On the refrigerator, held up with a single strip of mascape gone yellow at the edges, was a photograph. 2 women on a beach, somewhere warm, both of them laughing with their whole bodies, both with their fists raised at the sky in that ridiculous way you raise your fists when you're young and old, feels like it belongs to you, and nobody has told you yet that it doesn't. Zara in the back. Taller, broader through the shoulders, grinning so wide her eyes had nearly disappeared. Jade in the front, 21 years old, and already acting like she owned the entire coastline. Arms thrown wide, head tipped back, laughing at something that would exist in any photograph because it lived only in the sound she made. The sound Zara couldn't hear anymore, couldn't hear anything anymore. Zara touched the edge of the photograph with 2 fingers, just the edge. The way you touch something that might still burn you. The way you touch something you're not sure is still real or has become something else entirely, something made of memory instead of fact. She held her fingers there for 3 seconds. Then she picked up her bag and went to work. Ironside Martial Arts sat on the corner of Brennan Street and 5th, wedged between a dry cleaner and a shop that sold custom sneakers and had a line outside every Saturday morning, regardless of weather. The sign above the door was green with gold lettering. Someone had painted a small raised fist beneath the name and filled it in with the same gold. It had faded over the years to something closer to brass, but it was still there. Still recognizable. Zara had a key to the back door. She used it every evening, saying at 6 o'clock. Never the front. Never when students were arriving in their cars or parents were clustered near the entrance, checking phones and half watching their children through the glass. Always the back. Always quiet. Always in the gap between the last afternoon class clearing out and the evening session starting to fill. 9 months of this. Not 9 months of being the woman nobody looked at twice, which was exactly what she'd wanted. She moved through the dojo the way water moves through its space, finding the path of least resistance, following the same route every time because consistency was its own kind of safety. Vacuum first along the edges of the training floor where the rubber mats met the baseboards, then across the main floor, then equipment wipe down, then bathrooms, then the mop. An hour and a half if she kept pace. 2 hours if she let herself slow down, which she sometimes did on nights when the alternative was going home to the apartment with the one chair and the photograph on the refrigerator. The dojo smelled like sweat and rubber, and the specific accumulation of effort that builds up in a space where people push themselves tossed comfortable on a regular basis. Zazara knew that smell the way she knew the feel of her own hands, had breathed it in 7 different countries across 3 continents, had pressed her face into mats that smelled exactly like this one, and thought about nothing except the next move, the next hold, the next half-second of decision that separated winning from losing. Now she just cleaned them. That was fine. That was enough. She told herself this every evening, starting when she came through the back door and ending somewhere around 9:30 when she locked up behind herself. Told herself that quiet was sustainable, that invisible was safe, that a small life was still a life, and some people didn't even get that much. Jade hadn't gotten that much. So, Zara kept the vacuum moving along the edges of the mat and didn't think about Rio, didn't think about the wooden box under her bed. Didn't think about the fact that her body still moved like an athlete even when she was pushing a vacuum cleaner, still balanced on the balls of her feet, still took corners with the kind of controlled precision that had nothing to do with cleaning floors and everything to do with 11 years of competitive judo that didn't just leave when you told it to. The body remembers, even when you spend 3 years telling it to forget. Derek Holt was already in the building when she arrived that Tuesday, which was unusual. He taught the 6:30 evening class, but rarely showed up before 6:15, travel mug in hand, jacket still half on, already running through the session in his head before he'd changed into his gi. Tonight his car was in the lot when she arrived, and his office light was on with the door pulled most of the way shut. Zara didn't try to see through the gap. She set her bag down by the supply closet and started on the far end of the main floor, moving away from the office, keeping to the edges of the space the way she always did. But she was aware of him the way she was always aware of anyone in a room with her. Had been that way since she was 19 years old, and a coach in Oakland had told her that real social awareness wasn't something you switched on for competition. It was something you either had all the time, or you didn't really have it at all. She had it all the time, which meant she noticed was without looking directly when Derek's office door opened at 6:20 and he came out, still smoothing the lapels of his gi jacket. Noticed the set of his shoulders, the particular quality of his stillness as he stood in the doorway for a moment, before moving toward the mat cast. Something was sitting on him wrong tonight. She'd learned his rhythms over 9 months, the way you learn any recurring pattern in your environment, not through focused attention, but through simple accumulated observation. Tonight's rhythm was off. She kept the vacuum moving and didn't look up. The evening class started at 6:30, and she worked around the edges of it the way she always did. The supply room, the equipment area, the hallway leading to the bathrooms. Staying in the spaces the class didn't occupy, moving in the intervals between drills when the noise on the mat covered the sound of her work, and no one was looking in her direction. She watched Derek teach through the mirrors. Not because she was trying to. The Dix ran the full length of the eastern wall, and the class occupied the center of the floor, and there was no position in the building that didn't have a partial view of what was happening on the mat. She'd stopped pretending this was purely incidental about 3 months in. Derek was a good teacher when he was in the right headspace. She'd had enough time to see that clearly. Patient with the intermediate students. Precise with technique in a way that showed genuine knowledge, not performance. He could look at a student's stance, and identify the three things that needed correcting and keep them communicated in the specific language that actually reached people instead of going over their heads. That was a real skill. Not everyone could do a thing, could teach a thing, and Derek Holt could teach, but he had a look. A very specific, very brief look that arrived on his face when something complicated what he'd planned for a session. When a student needed more time than he'd allocated. When the variables didn't line up the way he'd expected them to. It was there and gone in under a second. A tightening around the eyes. A micro-adjustment in his jaw. Something that said this is not what I designed this for, and then the professional mask came back up and he moved on. Zara had cataloged it over 9 months the way she cataloged everything. Not analytically, exactly. More the way a body learns to read a room. Which you start to know which footsteps on the stairs belong with which person before you see them. Derek Holt was a good teacher who believed, somewhere underneath all the technique and the credentials, that difficulty was a kind of failure. That students who made things complicated were, on some level, doing it to themselves. That the people who disrupted the clean flow of a well-run class might be better served finding somewhere else to be. He'd never said any of this aloud. He didn't need to. The junior students had been on the mat for 20 minutes when the front door opened, and Diana Webb came in with Marcus. Zaza was in the equipment room. She heard them arrive. Heard was not the right word. She felt shift in the air of the building. The particular way a space changes when the population of it changes. She came to the equipment room doorway and saw them crossing the lobby toward the observation area where the other parents were beginning to collect. Diana in her work clothes, a blazer over a printed blouse, the look of a woman coming from somewhere professional and not having had time to change. Marcus beside her in his training gear, still buzzing with the specific energy of a 10-year-old who has been looking forward to something all day and is now very close to it. Marcus Webb had been coming to Ironside for 3 weeks. He was small for his age and moved with the loose-limbed ease of a child who'd spent a lot of time in his body without anyone telling him he was doing it wrong. His hearing aids were bright blue, the same blue as his sneakers, which was not a coincidence. Diana had mentioned once in passing in the parking lot that Marcus had chosen the color himself. Had said if people were going to notice the hearing aids anyway, they might as well notice something he'd actually picked. Zara had thought about that for 3 days. Marcus was deaf in a different way than she was. He'd been born with bilateral profound hearing loss. The world had always been this connoisseur for him, which meant he'd never had to grieve the version where it was loud. He navigated the mat the same way he sees him to navigate everything, by watching, by absorbing. His eyes moved constantly during drills, tracking the other students, processing the visual information of their movements, and translating it into his own body faster than most kids his age translated verbal instruction. He'd learned 3 foundational throws in 3 weeks, which was faster than most of the other junior students. Zara knew this because she watched. Because she was always in the building during class, and the mirrors were everywhere, and Marcus Webb had a way of holding himself on the mat that she couldn't stop looking at. A way of tilting his chin up when he was trying something new, like he was lifting his face to meet it. Like whatever was coming, he wanted to see it clearly. Jade had stood like that, at the exact same angle, the exact same quality of attention. Zaza went back to the equipment room and stayed there longer than she needed to. When she came out, Marcus was on the mat with the other junior students, and Derek was moving through the group making corrections. His body language was, his instruction was precise. Whatever had been sitting on wrong before class had been set aside for the work, which was the professional thing to do, and something he was good at. Until 7:20. She was near the back wall with the mop when Derek caught Diana's eye and gestured, subtly, toward the far corner, away from the cluster of parents, away from the students. Diana's posture shifted the way posture shifts when you know what a gesture like that usually means, and you are preparing yourself for whatever version of it this turns out to be. Marcus didn't see them go. He was finishing a footwork drill, focused entirely on his feet and the mat. Zara kept the mop moving. The corner they'd moved to was on her side of the room. She hadn't planned that. She wasn't moving toward them. She was already moving along the back wall, in the direction her cleaning route took her. And they had chosen a spot that put them in her path. By the time she understood the full geometry of the situation, she was close enough to read Derek's lips without any effort at all. She'd been reading lips for 3 years, could do it now the way she'd once done footwork drills, without thinking, without trying. The meaning arriving before she'd consciously processed the individual words. Derek said, "I wanted to catch you before pickup. I've been thinking about Marcus." Diana waited. Her chin came up slightly. The preparation. "I think this might not be the right fit for him." The mop stopped. Zara hadn't decided to stop it. Her hands just stopped. "What do you mean?" Diana said. Not a question. An invitation to say the thing more clearly so there would be no ambiguity about what was actually being said. Derek put his hand on the back of his neck. She'd seen that gesture before, cataloged it, his tell for when he was uncomfortable with himself. When he knew on some level that what he was about to say didn't entirely hold up. Martial arts instruction is verbal, commands, safety calls, real-time corrections. There are moments on the mat where a student needs to respond instantly to what I say. Marcus can't always do that. He follows visual cues, Diana said. He watches the other students. He's been improving every week. I know he has, hands still on the neck. But this isn't about keeping up. It's about whether I can instruct effectively and keep everyone safe when there's a student who can't respond to verbal commands. Diana said, "He is getting better every single week. Maybe there are programs better suited." There it was, that word, programs. The word that meant we have designed spaces for people like your son, and this wasn't one of them. The word that came wrapped in reasonable language and concerned tone and meant, at its center, go somewhere else. Zara had been 11 years old the first time she heard that word in that particular way. Standing in a community center in Oakland with her mother's hand on her shoulder and a well-meaning man explaining that there were programs for deaf youth. And maybe that was the more appropriate path, her mother had said quietly, and without raising her voice, "She'll train here." The man had not known how to respond to that. Zabra had gone on to win a Paralympic gold medal. The equipment room door was 6 feet to her left. She could go through it. She could finish the rest of her route and let this conversation be what it was. A thing between a teacher and a parent that had nothing to do with the woman who cleaned the floors and had 9 months of practice invisibility wrapped around her so tightly it had started to feel like skin. She could do that. Instead, she walked forward. Past the equipment room, past the version of herself that had been keeping her head down for 3 years, because keeping her head down had felt like the only thing that made sense after Jade. Past the careful, invisible life she'd built out of grief and guilt, and the belief that disappearing was what she deserved. She walked forward until she was standing at Diana's shoulder. Derek noticed her approach and turned. The flicker of irritation arrived fast and departed almost as fast, replaced by the performance of patience he used when students or parents did something unexpected during class. "Can I help you with something?" Zara looked at him, just looked. She had been told more than once, by more than one person over the years, that she had sick, difficult eyes, not cold, not hostile, just very steady. The eyes of someone who is paying close attention and intends to keep paying it regardless of how the person being watched feels about that. She shook her head. Once, small, definitive. Derek blinked. "Excuse me?" She held his gaze, didn't reach for her phone, didn't sign anything, didn't mime. Just stood in the space she'd entered and stayed there with the same calm she used on a mat. The calm that was not passivity, but presence. The psalm that said, "I'm exactly where I intend to be. This is a private conversation." She looked at Marcus, who had seen his mother now and was coming off the mat toward them, reading the room the way he always read rooms, through faces and posture and the invisible structure of tension in a space. His brow was furrowed. His hands were starting to move at his sides, the preliminary signs of someone forming a question. She looked back at Derek and shook her head again. The same movement, the same absolute certainty behind it. Derek's face cycled through several things: confusion, recalibration, and then something that had recognized the shape of what was happening and had decided to make it into something else, something he could use. He turned slightly toward the wider room, not fully, just enough to make sure the angle included the parents along the wall and the students drifting off the mat toward their bags. So now the cleaning staff wants to weigh in on how I run my class. A parent shifted near the far wall. Two students stopped pretending they weren't listening. I've been teaching martial arts for 15 years. His voice had gotten louder. More performance than conversation now. I have a third-degree black belt. I've trained students who've competed nationally. I've built this program from. He gestured at the mop with the particular precision of a man making a point with a prop. I'm not sure what expertise you're bringing to this conversation. Zara did not look at the mop. She looked at Derek and she waited. Which was worse. She could see it being worse by the way his expression shifted into a second wave of things faster than the first. Worse to be waited out quietly than to be argued with. Worse to be looked at with absolute stillness by someone who should have flinched and hadn't. Worse to be held to account by someone who wasn't even raising their voice because they didn't need to. Marcus arrived at his mother's side. He looked at Derek, at Diana, at Zara, back at Derek. His hands moved and he signed to Diana. What happened? Did I do something wrong? Diana's throat moved. She shook her head quickly, signed back. No, babe, nothing's wrong. The words and the truth of the situation, sitting very far apart from each other. Derek watched the exchange, and something moved behind his eyes that wasn't anger, wasn't satisfaction. Something more complicated that be enough time and enough quiet have become something useful. But Derek didn't give it time. He looked back at Zara. You want to say something? She pointed at herself, at the mat. The room understood the gesture before Derek did. She saw it move across the faces of the people along the walls. A mother put her hand over her mouth. One of the senior stunts, Calvin Reed, tall and on his brown belt, straightened from where he'd been leaning as against the far mirror and took 2 steps forward. Derek stared at her. Are you? Zara nodded. Zara once. This is. Stopped. Made a sound that wanted to be a laugh and wasn't quite. He looked around the room. The look of a man who expected to find allies and found only an audience waiting to see what came next. The cleaning lady, he said, to the room rather than to her, the way people address rooms when they've lost the thread of what they're actually doing, wants to on third-degree black belt instructor. Silence, not uncomfortable silence, not the fidgeting silence of a group of people who want to be somewhere else. Interested silence, weighted silence, the kind that has a direction to it. Calvin Reed said quietly, Sensei, just the word, just the title. The word doing the work of a full sentence, which was, you might want to think about this. Derek put his hand up without looking at Calvin. Fine. His voice had the strained steadiness of someone talking themselves into a decision and knowing it even as they did it. You want to get on that mat? We can make that happen. Tomorrow night, 7 o'clock. Full class as witnesses. Proper rules. He crossed his arms, his jaw set. When I win, you find yourself another place to work. Zazalks Limarcus. The boy was watching her with his hands half raised and his face holding a question he hadn't formed into signs yet. The furrowed brow, the wide eyes, the particular expression of a child who has learned to read adults' faces very carefully, because faces were often the only reliable source of information available to him. She looked at Diana, who met her eyes and gave the smallest possible nod. The nod of a woman who has done the math of the situation and arrived somewhere she can stand. Zara looked back at Derek and extended her hand. He looked at it. A long look. Something moved through his expression that was hard to name. Then, he took her hand and gripped it harder than the situation called for, the way he'd been doing everything tonight, with more force than necessary, as if force could settle questions that force was not designed to settle. Zara held the grip, steady. Didn't match his force, didn't need to. When he released, he flexed his fingers, quickly, almost without noticing he'd done it. 7 o'clock, he said. Don't be late. She nodded, picked up her mop, and went back to work exactly as she had been before any of it happened, which was either the most composed thing anyone in that room had ever witnessed, or the most unsettling. The lines between those two things turned out to be very thin. Owen Briggs came out of his office at 7:45. Owen had owned Ironside for 21 years and had spent those years developing a precise sensitivity to the different qualities of psi-sense a dojo could produce. There was post-class silence, which was the good kind, the settled kind, the silence of a space that had done what it was built to do. There was the silence of mild tension, a student having said something thoughtless, a drill gone sideways. And then there was this kind. The kind where a room full of people had witnessed something and hadn't yet decided how to metabolize it. He stood in the awful doorway and took in the clusters of parents speaking in low voices with too much eye contact. Kalona Reed at the edge of the mat, watching the back of the room where Zara was finishing the equipment, whopped down with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything. Derek by the changing room door with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and the specific look of a man who has done something he can't undo and is trying to decide how to stand in relation to that fact. "Someone want to tell me what I missed," Owen said. Calvin told him. Briefly and accurately, which was how Calvin did most things. Owen listened without interrupt. He had learned that most situations looked different after you heard the whole of them than they did after you heard part of them. And rushing to form opinions in the middle was how you ended up defending positions that didn't actually hold. When Calvin finished, Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he walked toward the back of the room. He positioned himself where Zara could see his face clearly. He'd figured out in the first few weeks of her employment that she read lips and had adjusted the way he communicated with her accordingly. Not dramatically, just facing her, speaking at a normal pace instead of a hurried one, making sure the light was on his face rather than behind him. Small things, things that cost nothing and mattered considerably. "Is this something you actually want to do?" he said. She nodded. Derek's genuinely skilled. "You understand that?" She nodded again. More emphatic this time. Owen studied her for a long moment. He thought about the employee file he'd looked at in the second month of her employment, her full legal name, her prior employment history, the gap in her work record that corresponded to dates he'd cross-referenced, quietly, alone, the name that had come up when he cross-referenced them. He hadn't then said a word, had hired her and not said a word, and given her the thing she'd come here looking for, which was space. The kind of space that doesn't ask you to explain yourself. The kind that just holds still while you figure out what comes next. He'd been doing it for 9 months, and something had shifted tonight. He could see it. Not in her face, which held the same composed surface as always, in her posture, in the distribution of her weight, in the way she was standing right now, even holding a mop handle, with everything set and centered in a way that had nothing to do with cleaning, and everything to do with a body that had never actually forgotten what it knew. Like a door that had been closed for a very long time, remembering what open felt like. Owen turned to face the room. "Tomorrow night," he said, with the volume and clarity of someone who has spent 2 decades managing spaces where clear communications was non-negotiable. 7 o'clock. I'll referee personally. Standard protocol. No head strikes, no small joint manipulation. First to submit or be stopped loses. He looked at Derek, agreed. Derek had clearly been expecting Owen to shut this down. Had prepared at some level for a reasonable conversation in which the owner of the establishment explained why this couldn't happen, and everyone dispersed, and the evening returned to something manageable. The agreement landed on him wrong. "What about my terms?" he said. "If I win, they stand." If she chooses them. Owen looked at Zara's, "And your terms if you win." Zara crossed the room to where Marcus was standing beside his mother. She crouched down to his level. Her hands moved. Whatever she signed to him, it changed his face completely. The worried, furrowed brow thus dissolved. Something lit up behind his eyes that was pure and uncomplicated, and had nothing anxious in it at all. He signed back rapidly, enthusiastically, his whole body involved in it. Diana's voice was careful and slightly unsteady when she translated. She says if she wins, Marcus stays in class. Full stop. No more conversations about programs or accommodations. He gets trained as a regular student. Diana stopped. That's it. That's her only condition. The room was quiet. That's it? Mark said. His voice had something in it he was working to keep under control. That's her big demand. It gets to stay in class. From across the room, Calvin said quietly, "That's not a small thing." Derek looked at him. Calvin's met his eyes without flinching, saying that's all she wants, like it's not much. It's everything. It's the whole thing. Derek looked at the floor. His jaw worked. Then he nodded, short and clipped. Fine, 7 o'clock. He walked to the changing room and the door swung shut behind him. The room exhaled. Zura's apartment was 20 minutes from the dojo on the bus. She usually read on the ride home library books with the small white stickers on the spine. But tonight she sat with her hands in her lap and watched the city slide past the window. The restaurants still open, amber light spilling onto sidewalks. The bus stops with their small populations of people waiting with the specific patience of people who are used to waiting. The intersections with their changing lights, green to yellow to red. The language of the city she had learned to read instead of hear. She let herself into the apartment, stood in the kitchen, drank a glass of water at the sink, and looked at Jade on the refrigerator, both of them on that beach. Both of them grinning like the world owed them something, and they fully intended to collect. She went to the bedroom, stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she got down on her knees beside the bed, not for the wooden box, for the gym bag beside it. Black canvas with a shoulder strap worn soft at the point where it had sat against her collarbone during the years she'd carried it 4 times a week. The zipper stuck slightly and then gave, and when she pulled it open, the smell that rose from it hit her somewhere behind the sternum in a place that hadn't been reached in a very long time. Chalk dust, old leather, the layered ghost of years of effort. Her hand wraps were inside. Worn to softness, the color faded from whatever red they'd started, as to something closer to rust. Her mouthguard in its case. A fold of compression fabric, and at the bottom, under everything, a small spiral notebook which hadn't opened in 3 years. She took out the notebook, sat cross-legged on the bedroom floor at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, and held it in her hands for a moment before opening it. It was Jade's. Not a diary. Jade had never kept a diary. But she'd been a person who wrote things down, the small specific things that other people let pass without recording, in whatever notebook or margin or receipt back happened to be available. She'd started bringing a dedicated notebook to Zara's competitions when Zara made the national team at 21, and Jade was 17, and had decided to say about the absolute unquestioning certainty she brought all her decisions that she was going to document every single thing about. Not the scores, not the official results, those were on the internet. The things that weren't. Zara's hands in the seconds before a match. The specific way she breathed during a hold. The expression that crossed her face when she had an opponent in position and was making the decision, in the fraction of a second available for such decisions, about exactly what to do with them. The way she looked after, win or loss. The private face before the public one came back. Jade had filled 4 notebooks across Zara's career. This was the last one. Zara turned to a page near the middle. Jade's handwriting, rounded, slightly slanted, smudged all on the because Jade was left-handed and had never solved the problem of her palm, dragging through what she'd just written. She used that leg sweep thing again today. The one I've watched 40 times and still don't fully understand. I asked her to explain it, and she said, your hip goes before your foot, and I said, that makes no sense, and she said, it makes complete sense, you're just not listening with the right part of yourself. She always does this, says things that sound like riddles and then looks at you with that face like you should obviously already know. Zaras read it twice. The second time, the words moved. She turned more pages, let herself come to the last entry, written 2 days before the phone rang, before everything divided permanently into before and after. Jan's handwriting slightly rushed, like she'd written it quickly before she lost the thought. Tomorrow. Surprise visit. She doesn't know I'm coming. I want to see her face when she sees me. She always thinks I still see her as my big sister who I watched from the changing room bench. She forgets I've been watching her for 10 years, and I know things about how she moves that her coaches don't know. She doesn't keep things, she moves through. That's what makes her exceptional, and also what makes her lonely sometimes. I keep trying to tell her, some things are worth keeping still for. She doesn't hear me. She will someday. I'm going to keep saying it until she does. Zara closed the notebook, sat with it in her hands. The city outside the window going on being the city, the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the specific quality of late-night silence in an apartment that contained only one person and had for 3 years. Her phone lit up on the nightstand. Diana Webb. I don't know what you're planning for tomorrow, but Marcus has since stopped signing since we got home. He told me you're the first person at that dojo who looked at him and saw him, not his hearing aids, not the complications. I don't know if you understand what that means to a mother. Maybe you do. We'll be there at 7. Zara read the message twice, then typed, "See you at 7." She put the phone down, reached into the gym bag, took out the hand wraps and set them on the nightstand next to the notebook. The old thing and the older thing, both of them real, both of them hers. She turned off the lamp, lay back in the dark. The city outside moving through its late-night version of itself. Traffic thinning. The restaurant below the dry cleaner, across the street, going dark. The particular quality of Atlanta at midnight, which was never quiet, but had its own frequencies, lower and slower than the daytime one, easier to rest inside. Zara lay still with her hands open at her sides, not holding anything, not pushing anything away. For the first time in 9 months, maybe longer, she didn't have to negotiate with herself about sleeping. Didn't have to find the angle, or the argument, or the specific thought that made the night manageable. She was already most of the way there before she finished the thought. Ready, for the first time in 3 years, to reach for something. She just didn't know yet exactly that something would turn out to be. Tomorrow would answer that. Tomorrow had always been the kind of day that answered things. The hand wraps were still on the nightstand when Zara woke up. She'd half expected them not to be. Half expected to open her eyes and find the nightstand the way it always was. Empty. The way her apartment was empty. The way her life had been emptied out and kept that way, carefully, deliberately, the way you keep a wound clean by not letting anything near it. But the wraps were there. Rust-colored, worn thin in places along the knuckles. Real in the specific way that things are real when you've held them in your hands and they've held you back. Zara sat up slowly. Sat on the edge of the bed the way she used to sit on the edge of the mat before a match. Not thinking yet, just arriving. Feeling where the body was tight and where it was loose and what it was telling her about the day ahead. Her shoulders were good. Her hips were good. Her hands, when she opened and closed them in the gray morning light, felt like what they were. Instruments that had been set down a long time ago and had been waiting without complaint to be picked back up. She made coffee, 2 cups, black, stood at the kitchen window and watched Atlanta wake up. Then she opened Jade's notebook to one of the blank pages near the back and wrote 3 words in her own handwriting, which was nothing like Jade's. Smaller, more controlled, the handwriting of someone who thought carefully before committing anything to paper. Not yet, soon. She looked at what she'd written, closed the notebook, drank her coffee, and started getting ready. She didn't go to the dojo in the morning. Her shift was evenings, 6 to 9:30, and she hadn't varied it by more than 10 minutes in 9 months. Varying it would have required making choices, and making choices would have meant admitting she had preferences about how her days were shaped, and admitting she had preferences would have meant caring about her life in a way she hadn't been ready to care about it. Instead, she went to the park 3 blocks east of her apartment. It was early enough that the park was mostly empty. A man doing chi near the fountain, with the unhurried focus of someone who had long since stopped worrying about whether anyone was watching. A woman with two dogs moving along the path at the pace the dogs preferred. A teenager in a bench with headphones on, eyes closed, in that particular private world that headphones create. Zara watched the teenager for a moment, the way she sometimes watched people with headphones. Not with envy exactly. Something more complicated than envy. Something that had gotten quieter over 3 years, but hadn't fully resolved itself into acceptance. She found the corner of the park she'd had in mind. Two large trees close enough together that the space between them felt separate from the rest of the park. Flat ground, morning light coming in at an angle that was clean and direct without being harsh. She set her bag down and warmed up. Slowly at first. The way you approach something you haven't done in a long time with the respect it deserves. Shoulder rotations, hip circles, the deliberate, methodical stretching of muscles that had been doing maintenance-level work for 3 years, instead of the real thing, that had kept themselves ready without all being asked to, because that was what bodies trained over a decade did. They stayed ready, even when you stopped asking them to, then faster. Footwork patterns she had drilled 10,000 times across 11 years on 4 continents. The lateral shuffle, the drop step, the pivot that set up the approach to a hip throw. Her feet found the shapes before her brain had finished thinking them, moved through the dew-damp grass with a precision that had nothing to do with the park or the Wednesday morning or the dog walker who glanced over and then went back to her doggas. This was not exercise. This was remembering, and the body had been waiting for it. Patient and faithful in the way only a body trained has over a decade can be patient. The muscle memory wasn't gone. It hadn't gone anywhere. It had been sitting in a room with the lights off for 3 years, and when she turned the lights back on, it was exactly where she'd left it. Organized and complete and steady, the way certain things are ready because they were built to last and were built well and had never really stopped being what they were, just because nobody was using them. She moved through the footwork patterns for 30 minutes. Then she stood still in the middle of the park, with her chest rising and falling and the morning light on her face, and felt, for the first time in 3 years, like something that had been adhesed in place was beginning to come loose. Slowly, like the careful separation something that had been sealed shut. But moving. She was moving. She was at a table near the window of the Auburn Avenue branch library by 9 o'clock. The library was one of the few places in the city that felt fully comfortable to her. Nobody expected conversation in a library. Nobody looked at you sideways for sitting in one place for 2 hours without appearing to have a concrete purpose. The whole design of the space was built around the premise that being quietly present was a legitimate way to exist, that you didn't have to be doing something visible to have a reason to be there. Her kind of place. She had Jade's notebook open and a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow, and she was reading through the entries, the pie she sometimes did on mornings when the apartment felt too small for what she was carrying. Not all of them. Specific ones. The ones that contained the things Jade had noticed that nobody else had bothered to notice or record. Her phone vibrated on the table at 9:47. Calvin Reed, "Can we talk before tonight? It's important." She looked at the message, looked at the notebook, typed back, Auburn Avenue Library, 2nd floor, window table on the east side. He arrived 23 minutes later. Calvin Reed was 27 years old and had the build of someone who had been genuinely athletic his whole life without particularly trying. The functional kind of fitness that came from moving a lot, rather than training specifically for how it looked. He had an open face. The kind that was easy to read, which was either a liability in competitive environments or simply the face of someone who had never needed to hide much because they hadn't had much to hide. He sat down across from her, glanced at the notebook, didn't ask about it, which she noted. The people who didn't immediately ask about the thing on the table were usually the people worth talking to. He put his phone on the table between them, screen facing up, paused on a video frame. She looked at it. knew what she was looking at before her brain had finished processing the image, the specific configuration of the overhead lighting rig, the edge of a scoreboard showing the Paralympic rings in blue and green and red and yellow and black, the corner of a blue competition mat, Rio, 2016. She looked up at Calvin. He said, keeping his voice at library volume, "I found it last night, after you left. He wasn't whispering exactly, but he was close to it. I'd been trying to place you for months. Something about the way you move when you're working, like I'd seen it before, but in a different context, and I couldn't locate where." He gestured at the phone. "Then I looked up your name from the staff board, and this was the first result." She waited. "I watched the semifinal and the final both," he said, 3 times. He paused. His jaw moved once. "I have 4 years of judo training, and I played high school wrestling, and I know enough to understand what I'm looking at. And what I was looking at was..." He stopped, tried again. "I don't have the right vocabulary for it. I just know I've never seen anyone move like that." Zara said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that which belonged to the version of herself that still existed, the version that would have known how to receive that kind of statement, how to hold it, without either deflecting or being flattened by it, had been packed away with the rest of things she wasn't using. Calvin said, "I'm not here to tell anyone. I want you to know that's not what this is." He put the phone away. I'm Peter because I watched that video and then I thought about tonight, and I wanted you to know that I think what you're doing is right. Whatever your reasons are." He looked at her steadily. "I think it's right." Zara turned to a blank page in the notebook, picked up the pen that lived in the spiral, wrote 4 words and turned the notebook so he could read them. "How long have you known ASL?" "Since I was a kid," he said. "My cousin, Maya, grew up with it. I'm rusty, but I catch most of it if people aren't signing too fast." He almost smiled. "I caught enough of what you signed to Marcus last night." She wrote, "What did you catch?" He looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. "You told him he belonged there, and that some people forget how to see that." He paused, "And that you were going to remind them." She looked at what she'd written, turned the notebook back around. Wrote, "Don't say anything to Owen." "Already decided that," Calvin said. He stood, pushed the chair back, picked up his jacket. "I'll see you at 7. He started toward the stairs and then stopped. Didn't turn around. Said to the middle distance between himself and the window, "For what it's worth, I think she'd be proud of you." He didn't say who. He walked to the stairs before she could respond, which she understood was intentional. She sat with the empty chair across from her for a long time. Then she turned back to Jade's notebook, to the last entry. Read the last paragraph again. "She doesn't keep things she moves through." I keep trying to tell her, some things are worth keeping still for. She doesn't hear me. She will someday. I'm going to keep saying it until she does. She put her hand flat on the page, kept it there. The afternoon had a particular quality to it, the specific texture of hours that know they are leading somewhere and move accordingly. Not slowly, not quickly. With a kind of deliberate weight that made part of the afternoon feel more distinct than afternoons usually felt. She went home, changed into the compression shirt and training shorts she'd found at the back of the closet. They still fit. Of course they still fit. Her body had been, despite her 3 years of concerted effort to just be a person who cleaned floors and read library books and kept her head down, stubbornly maintaining itself, refusing to forget, keeping the architecture of what it knew intact beneath the ordinary surface of what she'd been asking it to do instead. She stretched. The full routine. The one that took 40 minutes and moved through every major joint and muscle group in a specific sequence she'd learned at 20 years old and had never found a reason to modify because it worked. And things that worked didn't need to be fixed. By the end of it, she felt like herself in a way that almost nothing else produced anymore. Then she sat on the floor of her living room and thought about Derek Holt. Not the version he'd performed for the room last night. The version she'd been observing for 9 months. The version existed in the small, unrehearsed moment. The way he stayed after class sometimes, 20 or 30 minutes. to work one-on-one with a student who was struggling with a specific technique. Patient in those moments. Genuinely patient. The kind that cost something rather than the kind that was just the absence of impatience. The way he'd handled the situation last spring with a teenage boy who'd shown up to Cox class twice in a row with bruises that had nothing to do with training. And Derek had noticed and hadn't made anything of it in front of the group, but had quietly made sure the right people were informed. That had taken something. That had been a person doing the right thing when nobody was requiring him to. And the look. The flicker behind the eyes when something complicated his plan for a session. Both things lived in the same man. She'd watched them long enough to know they weren't performing for each other. They were just both there, the good teacher and the frightened one. The man who could see clearly and the one who flinched from certain things he saw. She thought about what that must feel like from the inside. Then she thought about what it had felt like to live inside her own life for the past 3 years and understood that she knew. She knew exactly what that felt like. The things you build to protect yourself from one truth becoming the wall between you and several others, she knew. She arrived at the dojo at 6:45, through the front door, first time in 9 months. She had the gym bag over her left shoulder, and she walked through the entrance without slowing Sal's down and without looking at herself in the lobby mirror the way she'd have looked at herself, they say herself 9 months ago, checking whether the invisibility was holding, whether she'd successfully become the background. She didn't need the invisibility tonight. She was done needing it. Owen was at the front desk. He looked at the gym bag, looked at her face, said nothing. Just nodded, once the small, economical nod of a man who has been thinking about this moment for some time and is not surprised by its arrival. The dojo was fuller than a normal Wednesday evening, not packed. Owen had been clear about the internal nature of what was happening here, and the people who trained at Ironside understood what that meant and had respected it. But the regular Wednesday class had stayed after they'd usually go home, and some of the Thursday regulars had found reasons to come in a night early, and there were person sitting in the observation area who didn't usually stay past pickup. Faces she recognized from 9 months of peripheral observation. Faces she'd cleaned around and worked around and been invisible around. Looking at her now with a different kind of attention she'd ever gotten from this room before, she scanned the space without appearing to scan it. Old habit. The intake of a room before you decided what to do in it. Calvin was against the far wall, arms crossed, watching everything and saying nothing, which was how Calvin processed situations he was still forming opinions about. Marcus was in the front row with Diana. He was wearing the same blue hearing aids, vivid against the side of his head. He'd also worn his best training clothes, the ones that were clean and unwrinkled in a way that said someone had thought about this morning, had laid these out, had decided that tonight deserved the good clothes. Diana beside him, straight-backed with her hands in her lap and the composure of a woman who has been keeping herself together for her child and is very good at it. When Marcus saw Zara, he stood up. She stopped, went down to his level. He signed. "Are you nervous?" She considered it honestly. Then, a little. The right kind of nervous. He thought about this, his brow furrowed in the way it furrowed when he was taking information seriously. Then, what's the right kind? The kind that means something that matters is about to happen, and you're ready for it. He absorbed this, then gave the nod, the one she'd started to recognize as his full sentence nod. The one that meant, "I understand, I accept this, we can move forward." She stood up, looked Diana, said quietly, "Thank you for coming through the photo tonight." Zara held her gaze, then she walked toward the mat. Derek was already warming up. He'd arrived at 6, according to Owen, had worked through his preparation routine twice, till was on the mat now, moving through combinations that were technically precise, and also running slightly too hot. More force than a warm-up required. More speed. The kind of preparation that's burning something off rather than building something up. He was in his G. Black Belt nodded the particular neatness of some who wanted the room to be clear about exactly what they were looking at before anything else happened. Zer watched him from the edge of the mat for a moment. He had real skill. She'd always known that. 15 years of training and a genuine third-degree black belt that he'd earned through actual competition, not just accumulated hours in a friendly dojo. His footwork was good. His timing was good. His transitions between techniques had the smoothness of someone who drilled them past the point of thought. She'd been watching him teach for 9 months, and she could separate what was for show from what was actually there. What was actually there was considerable, and it wasn't going to be enough. Not because she was better in some abstract categorical way, because she understood something about this specific match that Derek didn't understand yet. She'd had 11 years of competitive judo at the highest level in the world to teach her that the physical contest was the last thing that decided a fight. What decided it was what was happening underneath, what each person was actually trying to resolve, what they needed the outcome to mean. Derek needed this to mean that he was right, that the higher Greek he'd built and maintained and defended was legitimate, that his authority over this CISP and the people in it was earned and unquestionable. Zara didn't need it to mean anything about herself. She just needed Marcus Webb to have a place to train. That asymmetry was going to matter. Owen stepped to the center of the mat. The room settled. Standard rules, he said, at the volume he used when he needed the whole space bay. No head strikes, no small joint manipulation, no throws targeting the neck or spine. Match ends with submission, stoppage, or voluntary withdrawal. I'm the only referee. My call is final. He looked at both of them. This is consensual. Both parties agreed. Any questions? Neither of them had questions. Touch and step back. They met in the center. Derek extended his hand, put more into the grip than the ritual called for. The measuring grip. The one that was supposed to say something before the match started, establish something about force and presence, and who was going to be the one setting the terms. Zara met his hand, not matching the force, not yielding to just present, steady. Her grip saying nothing except that are there. When he released, he flexed his fingers once. Quickly, they stepped back to opposite edges. Owen said, "Begin." Derek came forward immediately. Because Derek was angry, even if he hadn't named it to himself yet. Had been angry since the night before when a woman with a mop had stood into his space and looked at him without flinching and shaken her head. And the room had shifted in a way that he hadn't been able to shift back. Had been angry since this morning when he'd sat in his car in the parking lot with his phone in his hand, looking at something found online and had made a choice that the anger made for him before he'd had a chance to think it through properly. He came forward with a probing combination. Right hand, left hand, body feint, low kick, testing ranges, testing reactions, the controlled aggression of an experienced fighter, assessing an unknown opponent before committing to anything definitive. Zara moved, not back, sideways. A lateral step off the line of his right hand that put her at his 2 o'clock and made the punch land on empty air. The movement was small, economical. The minimum necessary to not be where he was aiming, which was the principle she'd built her entire competitive career on. You didn't need to go far. You needed to go exactly far enough. Derek adjusted. Came again. She moved again. Different angle. His left hand this time, which she'd identified 3 months ago as the one he trusted more, the one that closed combinations, the one that was supposed to land after the right hand had done its preparatory work. She stepped off the line of it and reset before he'd finished the follow-through. He was working harder than she was, already, 2 exchanges in. Not because the attacks had been demanding, because he'd put more behind each one than it called for, and that kind of overconsumption compounded. Extra percent of force you put into an attack that doesn't connect is a percent you've spent without a return. She hadn't spent anything yet. She was reading, taking in information about his patterns, his preferences, his timing, the specific grammar of how he moved when he was trying to solve a problem. Around the room, the watching had changed quality. The crowd had arrived expecting something quick. Derek demonstrating efficiently and definitively the distance between a black belt instructor and a woman who cleaned floors. They'd been prepared to feel slightly uncomfortable about that, and then process it and go home. What they were getting instead was something didn't have an easy category. Something that required them to keep watching in order to understand what they were seeing. Calvin, against the far wall, hadn't moved. His arms were still crossed, but his weight had shifted forward, almost imperceptibly, in the way that someone's weight shifts when they recognize something. Derek changed approach. He stopped the long-range probing and moved to close the distance. Reached for a grip on her training shirt, because judo always moves eventually into the clinch, into the grip exchange. That becomes leverage, that becomes throw. His hands committed to the reach. She wasn't there. Not in the sense of having stepped away, exactly. More in the sense of having shifted her weight and changed her angle at the precise moment. His hands needed her to be stationary, so the grip found the air at her shoulder rather than the shoulder itself. She pivoted around the outside of his reach, reset 3 feet to his left. He turned to face her. His expression had moved through irritation and arrived somewhere more unsettled. The expression of a skilled Jew person, this discovering that skill is not the determining variable they'd understood it to be. That the thing they've relied on to tell them who they are in a room is behaving differently than it should. She recognized that look. Had seen it in competition across 11 years and across all the different faces it wore depending on the person behind it. Had always felt, when she saw it, something more complicated than satisfaction, something that understood the specific disorientation of having the floor move under your certainty. Derek pushed the pace. Harder, wider. The technical precision beginning to erode as frustration and fatigue started to compound each other the way they always compounded, each one feeding the other. The frustration generating tension that accelerated the fatigue lowering the threshold for more frustration. She absorbed it, redirected it, made small adjustments with large consequences for his balance. Let his force move through the space she'd occupied a moment before and dissipate harmlessly. This was the specific thing. The thing that had taken her from good to exceptional, and from exceptional to the best in the world at her weight class in Paralympic competition. Not power, though she had power. Not speed, though she had speed. It was the understanding of force as information rather than opposition. An opponent's strength told you where they ended, which told you where they weren't. You didn't fight the information. You used it. Derek had power. Derek had speed. Derek had 15 years of genuine technical training and a competitive record that justified his belt. None of it resolved the problem of trying to apply force to someone who kept not being where you applied it. He knew this. She could see him knowing it. The recalibration happening behind his eyes. The search for the angle that would let his advantages matter. She watched him try 3 different strategic adjustments in the space of 4 minutes. Watched him look for the thing that would change the terms of the exchange, and she gave him nothing to lock onto. Kept shifting. Kept reading. Kept being somewhere slightly other than where he needed her to be. 8 minutes in. 10. He was sweating through his gi. His breathing was audible from the edges of the mat. His technique was getting wider, more telegraphed, the precision that came from training degrading under the compound pressure of exertion and frustration. She looked the same as when she'd stepped on. The silence in the room had changed again. Had become the kind of silence that has weight and direction. The kind that means everyone present has understood something at the same time, and nobody has yet decided what to do with the understanding. Diana Webb had both hands pressed together in her lap. Marcus was sitting forward on the edge of his seat, both palms flat on his knees, eyes tracking every movement with the total absorption of a child who has stopped being a spectator and started being a student without realizing the transition happened. A mother in the observation area leaned over to the woman beside her and said something Zara couldn't read because the woman's face was angled away. But she saw the second woman nod. The slow, emphatic nod of someone confirming something they'd suspected. Derek heard the whispers, or felt them. The shift in the room's attention. The way it had moved from watching him to watch out her to watching the space between them, which was a different thing entirely and not what he'd planned for when he'd planned this evening. His face reddened, and then he made the decision that exhaustion and wounded pride make together when they're left unsupervised. He stopped trying to be a martial artist and started trying to end the conversation by force. He came at her with his biggest punch. Full commitment. Everything consolidated behind a right hook that would have finished the match if it had connected the way it was supposed to connect. It didn't connect. Zara had been waiting for this. Not for this specific technique. For this specific moment. The moment when frustration outweighed training and a fighter stopped trying to win and started trying to prove something, which were different objectives with different implications for how they move. She slipped the punch with a movement so economical it registered to the room as barely moving at all. A slight lean, a weight transfer. His fist passed by her temple close enough that she felt the air move. His momentum carried him forward. She moved into the space the miss had opened. Her hand found his extended arm. Her hip turned into him. Her foot went behind his and found the geometry that had been available since the first grip exchange, when she'd felt his weight distribution and cataloged it for later. The throw was ozagoshi, major hip throw, foundational. The kind of technique that gets taught in the first month of judo training is the principle it's built on is the principle that everything else is built on. You don't oppose the force, you redirect it. You add to it. You let it carry the person further than they intended to go. She drilled it 10,000 times across 11 years, which meant the 10,001st time was not a decision. It was not an effort. It was just what happened next. Derek left the ground. The arc was clean. The rotation was complete. He landed on his back with the full back impact that a properly executed ogoshi produces, the sound of it crossing the silent room like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Zara stood above him, her right hand on his arm extended. The beginning position of the Juji Gatame armbar that would end the match if she completed the transition. She held it. 1 second. 2. Long enough for the room to understand what it was looking at. Long enough for the position to be legible to everyone present. Long enough for Derek, staring up at the ceiling with his chest heaving, to understand it too. Then she released his arm, stepped back, stood still. The room did not react immediately. The reaction when it came was not applause or exclamation. It was more like the room catching a breath it had been holding and not realizing it until the release. A collective exhalation. A soft sound that was neither celebration nor commiseration, but something more honest than either. Derek lay on his back, looking at the ceiling. Calvin Reed said very quietly, to no one in particular or to everyone equally. There it is. Owen, at the edge of the mat, said nothing, but his expression had arrived somewhere it had apparently been traveling toward for a while. Derek sat up, slowly. He looked at Zara, at his own arm, at the ceiling again. The expression he'd walked in with, the armored certainty, the performed confidence of a man who needed the room to see him as the authority, was gone. What was underneath was rawer and realer and significantly harder to sustain without covering it with something. He said barely, "Lucky." She looked at him. Didn't answer, didn't need to. He said it again, louder, needing it to be true. "Lucky! You caught me off balance." Nobody in the room agreed with him. Nobody said that either. Zara extended her hand. He looked at it for a long moment, then looked away. Got himself up without taking it, which was what she'd expected. He wasn't ready yet. There were still several minutes of things that needed to happen before he'd be ready. She lowered her hand, waited. What came next was not in any match protocol Owen had refereed in 21 years. Derek came back at her. Not with technique. With the thing that lives underneath technique, when technique has been stripped away by exhaustion and humiliation, and the specific panic of a self-image in the process of collapse. His attacks were wider now, less controlled, Moving into territory wasn't competitive anymore. That was something older and more primal, and considerably more honest about what was actually happening inside him. She handled it the way she'd been handling everything. Moved, redirected, made his force irrelevant by not being where it was aimed. But she was also watching his face now in a different way, not reading his next attack, reading him. The way she'd, sometimes in competition, reached a point in a match where the technical reading became secondary to the deeper reading, where what mattered was what the person across from her was actually fighting, which was often not her. She saw the moment when it changed. He was exhausted, and she'd just made another of his combinations find empty space. He spun to face her, and something in his eyes crossed a line. The anger got bigger than itself, moved past the competition and past the dojo and past the specific grievance of tonight into something that had been there a long time before tonight and had been looking for somewhere to go. His hand came up, high, uncontrolled. Not a martial arts technique. The movement of someone who has stopped performing and started expressing, which was in its own way the most honest thing he'd done all evening. Derek's fist came down in a wild arc, aimed not quite at her, but in her direction with force and an intention that had moved outside the rules of the match, and outside the rules of the space, and outside the rules of what Derek Holt had always told himself he was. Za stepped in. Not away. In. She caught his wrist with both hands, just below the point of impact. The force of the movement stopped and held, her body fully engaged in the hold, her weight and her leverage doing what 10,000 hours of training had built them to do. Her other hand came up and pressed flat against the center of his chest, gently. The room stopped. Derek's fist was 6 inches from her face. His whole body was shaking, not from exertion, but from the kind of shaking that happens when something you've been holding for a very long time finally runs out of the container it's been kept in. His face was wet. His breathing was ragged in a way that had nothing to do with the physical work of the match. Not, Zara looked up at him. Not with triumph. Not with anger. Not with the satisfaction that winning was supposed to produce. With recognition. The specific recognition of someone who knows what they're looking at because they've looked at it in a mirror. Not the anger, not the loss of control, but the thing underneath those things. The grief that had found the wrong shape to live in. The pain that had built itself a set of walls and called the walls strength, and then defended the walls past the point where defending them made sense. She knew that. She'd been living that for 3 years. His hand went limp in her grip. She guided it down, slowly, carefully, her palm still resting against his chest, over the place where his heart was hammering through the fabric of his gi. She shook her head, not in judgment, not in dismissal, not from a place of superiority, just, no more. This part is done. We can stop now. Derek's face crumpled, all at once, not gradually. The way a structure fails when the load-bearing thing at the center gives way, everything going at once rather than piece by piece. His hand fell to his side, his head went down, and he stood in the center of the mat, making no sound but shaking with the effort of containing something that was too large for the containment he'd been using for it. While the room watched and mobbed, nobody moved, and the silence had a texture to it, and a specific weight with it. And underneath both of those things, something that felt improbably like mercy. Owen said very quietly, "Match." Nobody argued. Nobody moved yet. Because something had broken open in the middle of this room, and breaking open requires a moment before you can see what the aftermath is going to look like. Before you know whether the thing that broke was something that needed to break or something that was going to be very hard to put back together. Zara kept her hand on Derek's chest until the shaking slowed. Then she stepped back and stood with him in the silence the way you stand with someone after something significant has happened to them. Not fixing it, not narrating it, just present in the space beside them, which is sometimes the most accurate and the most necessary thing one person can offer another. The room was still. Marcus Webb in the front row had his hands in his lap and his hearing aids catching Zempa over light and has his eyes moving between Derek and Zara with the total focused attention of someone who has understood, through all the channels available to him, that what just happened in this room was important, that it was about more than a match, that it had something to do with him, even though it had also gone far past him into territory that was adult and complicated and would take time to fully resolve. He looked at Zara. She caught his eye across the room and gave him the smallest possible nod. "Still here," the nod said. "All of us. Still here." The room stayed quiet for a long time after Owen said match. Not the restless quiet of people waiting for permission to leave. Something else, the specific stillness that settles over a space. The people in it have witnessed something real and are still in the process of understanding what it cost and what it meant. They didn't reach for phones, didn't shuffle toward exits, just stayed, held in place by what they'd seen, the way you're held in place. By some you're only going to get one chance to be present for. Derek stood in the center of the mat, with his head down and his shoulders curved inward. The posture of someone who has just had something very large and very heavy set down after carrying it for a long time. Relief and exposure arriving in the same moment. His gi was disheveled. His face was wet in the way that a face gets wet when the person wearing it has stopped trying to manage what it shows. Zara stood 3 feet away, not retreating, not pressing, just there, the way she'd been there all evening. It was Marcus who moved first. He stood up from his seat in the front row with the decisive physicality of a 10-year-old who has finished deciding and is ready to act. Walked across the floor and stopped in front of Derek without hesitating at the edge of the mat the way adults hesitated. He just walked up and stopped and looked. Derek felt the approach and raised his eyes. His hands came up slowly, shaking still. He brought them up anyway and formed 2 signs. The hand shapes not quite right. The movement too large, the wrist position slightly off, the whole thing carrying the unmistakable quality of something learned from a screen in the middle of the night by someone who had never done it before, and was doing it anyway because not doing it was no longer something he could live with. "I'm sorry." 2 words, imperfect, effortful, completely sincere. Marcus looked at Derek's hands, then at his face, reading both with the total attention he brought to everything, the attention that came from having learned early that faces and hands were the primary text of the world, and you read them completely, or you miss things that matter. What he read in Derek's face alongside the imperfect signs was the same thing Zara had felt when her palm pressed against Derek's chest in the center of the mat. Something real that had cost something real to produce, something that was not for the room. Marcus glanced at his mother once, then back to Derek. He raised his hands. "It's okay. Simple. The forgiveness of someone who hasn't yet learned into forgiveness complicated, which was the innocence of childhood or a specific kind of wisdom that childhood occasionally produced before the world trained it out." Then, because Marcus Webb was fundamentally and stubbornly himself in every circumstance, he signed one more thing. "Your signs need work." Derek stared at him. Something crossed his face that had no clean name. Several things arriving at once, surprise and discomfort and something its wasted toward being moved, all of them running into each other was in resolving after a moment into a sound that came out of his chest that was short and real and entirely involuntary. A laugh, actual and unperformed, and nothing like the sounds he'd been making all evening. Diana put her hand over her mouth, not to hide distress. "The other thing," Calvin against the far wall dropped his head briefly when he raised it. His expression had done something in the vicinity of a smile. Marcus signed matter-of-factly, "I can teach you if you want." Derek looked at this boy, this 10-year-old with his best training clothes, and his bright blue hearing aids, and his complete unself-conscious offer, and the total absence in his face of any awareness that what he was doing was generous or more than most adults would have managed. He was just offering a thing he had that someone else needed. Derek said, his voice rough, "I'd really like that." He meant it. Everyone in the room could tell. Owen moved to the center of the mat without theater. He stood where the light was good, and the sight lines were clear and said, "Before anyone leaves, I want to say something." The room settled. What happened tonight was not a fight. A fight is what happens when two people are trying to hurt each other. He paused. This was a conversation. The kind that doesn't always find words first. He looked around slowly. This school in here 21 years. In that time, I've had a lot of conversations about what a dojo is supposed to be. What we owe each other in a space like this. Something moved across his face that was personal and old. I've been wrong about some things. I've kept quiet when I should have spoken. Starting tomorrow, I'm making changes. New programs, new approaches. He looked at Zara. I have a proposal I'd like to discuss. When you're ready. She held his gaze. Nodded. He nodded back. All right, he said. Get him safe. The room emptied slowly. People reluctant to leave something behind that had attached itself to them, and that they'd be turning over on the drive home and in the middle of the night. Calvin stopped beside Zara on his way out, stood for a moment without speaking. Then, "You held back. Multiple times you had him and let him up." Not a question. Why, she signed. Because winning wasn't the point. You can't tell someone what they're doing. You have to show them. And they have to be ready to see it. He was quiet. Then, "You've been thinking about more than tonight." She signed. "I've been thinking about Marcus." He nodded slowly, picked up his jacket, started for the door and stopped without turning around. Said, to the middle's distance, "For what it's worth, I think she'd be proud of you." He didn't say who. He walked out before she'd respond. Most of the room had cleared when the woman approached Owen. Zara noticed her because there was something in her movement that distinguished itself. Deliberateness. The movement of someone who has been waiting for the specific right moment and has decided, this is it. Middle-aged, well-dressed in the understated register that said professional. A quality of cultivated stillness that Zara recognized because she'd spent years building the same thing. The woman stopped beside Owen, said something. Owen's expression shifted with the small recalibration of a man absorbing new information. She placed a card on the counter beside him, said something else. Then she turned and found Zara across the room. Their eyes met. The woman's face neutral and contained, and underneath both of those things, something that looked like the specific relief of someone who has carried something a long distance and has finally found the place to set it down. She sealed Zara's gaze for a moment, then walked to the front door and left. Owen crossed the room, positioned himself where the light was clear on his face. "Her name is Dr. Patricia Owens," he said, pausing on the name. "Director of Athlete Development, U.S. Paralympic Committee." He watched her face. "She's known your location for approximately 6 months. She didn't contact you. Her words were that she wanted to respect your timeline." Zara went very still. "She asked me to pass along a message. You don't have to hear it." Zara didn't move. Owen took that as a yes. "You don't owe anyone anything. Not the committee, not the program, not anyone who watched you compete." He held her gaze. "But there are young athletes in the Paralympic pipeline right now. Several of them deaf, talented, some considerably more than talented. And there is nobody in the current coaching structure who looks like them, who can stand in front of a 16-year-old who has been told in 100 small ways that there is a ceiling above them and say with their whole history, 'I know that ceiling. I went through it, and I can show you where the door is.'" He held out the card. Zara looked at it for a long moment, took it. Owen said, "No timeline, no pressure. The offer doesn't expire." She closed her hand around the card, nodded. That was all that needed to be said about it tonight. Diana found her near the edge of the mat. She walked up and stopped an arm's length away and looked at Zara the way you look at something that has turned out considerably more than you prepared yourself for. Then she took Zara's hand, both of hers around one of Zara's. She said, "I don't know your whole story. You don't owe me your whole story, but I know what it costs to stand up in a room and stop being invisible after you've worked to make yourself that way." She squeezed. "Jade would be proud of you." Zara seized it without doubt deflecting, let it land where it was aimed. she said, in the voice still finding its range. I'm trying to deserve that. Diana's grip tightened. You already do. You just haven't caught up to believing it yet. Those aren't the same thing. They stood like that for a moment. Then Diana looked toward Marcus on the bench, pulling on his jacket, sleeve inside out the way it always ended up, still signing something to himself, he said. He's going to talk about tonight for a month. His teacher, his cousins, the man at the corner store who doesn't sign, but Marcus talks to him anyway. A sound that was almost a laugh. He told me in the car on the way here that you're the first adult at this dojo who made him feel like showing up was the right decision. Zara looked at him. The blue hearing aids, the inside-out sleeve, the animated hand still moving. She said, he was always the right decision. Someone just needed to say so. But Diana looked at her for a moment longer. I then nodded. The nod of someone who isn't going to argue with a true thing. Marcus saw her coming and straightened on the bench hedge. She crouched down to his level. He looked at her face for a moment, then signed. That was the most amazing thing I've ever seen in real life. She signed. It was just judo. He shook his head firmly. No, it wasn't. She looked at him. Then, no. It wasn't. He signed. What was it? She thought about how to answer honestly. Then signed, remembering something I'd been trying to forget. He absorbed this. Then, why were you trying to forget it? Because I thought I didn't deserve it anymore. His brow furrowed. That's a weird reason. She almost smiled. I know. Do you still think that? She looked at him, at the blue hearing aids and the inside-out sisson sleeve in the face that asked questions without softening them, because softening them had never occurred to him as something questions needed. She signed. Less than I did this morning. He nodded. The full sentence nod. Then, with the directness of a child who hasn't learned to approach certain subjects from a safe angle. Will you teach me? Really teach me? Not accommodate me. She heard the distinction, the precise and important difference between being managed and being trained, between handled carefully and taken seriously. She said it out loud and signed it at the same time. Both together, voice rough at the edges but present, not apologizing for itself. Yes, starting next week, his face did the thing. The grin that belonged to no audience. The private conversation between a person and the thing they just found out of was available to them. Diana appeared at his shoulder. Time to go. Marcus signed goodbye with his whole body in it. She signed it back. Watch them, Sam, go through the front door. Diana's hand on his shoulder. Marcus still signing at his side, narrating the evening in the only language that was fully his. The door all closed. Derek found her when the room was nearly empty. Street clothes. Now, the diminished look of a man who has been through aftermath and is carrying the aftermath through the simple processes of the evening. He stopped at the edge of the mat. Can I sit? She moved slightly to indicate room. He sat, not close, both them at the edge, facing the center, like there was still something out there that required attention. He said, I looked you up last night, after I heard Calvin asking around. He paused. I watched Loose House 10-16 final. Twice. I could have called this off this morning. I knew who you were before I walked in here tonight. His jaw moved. I didn't call it off. I was more concerned with how backing down would look than with what the right thing was. He said it carefully, trying to be accurate rather than self-exonerating. That's not something I'm proud of. She signed, angling her hands toward him. Why did you really want Marcus out of the class? He looked at her hands. Read enough. My father was in a wheelchair from the time I was 7, he said. Accident at work. It wasn't what it did to him, he handled it. It was what it did to me. Around him, at school, the way people looked and the way kids talked. He paused. I spent a long time building something nobody could attach that to. Something just. He opened his hands. Strong, no asterisk. He looked at the mat. And then Marcus walked in. Didn't do anything. Just showed up and started learning. It was getting genuinely good, and it shouldn't have bothered me. He stopped, but it pulled up something I'd decided was dealt with, and instead of looking at what it was pulling up, He didn't finish that sentence. You watched me do it. I don't need to describe it. She signed. Was your father proud of what you built here? Derek was quiet for a long time. He came to my black belt test, he said finally. 3rd degree. Took 2 buses. The venue had steps, and he sat outside in the cold for 20 minutes before someone noticed and brought him in through the side entrance. He paused. He watched the whole test from his chair in the back. When it was over, he was crying, which he didn't do, and he grabbed my arm and said, "I've never been so proud in my life." He looked at his hands. "I made it mean the wrong thing," he said. "I took something he was proud of and turned it into getting away from something he represented. Like the thing I built was proof I'd escaped something instead of." He stopped. Instead of something that came from him, that he gave me by being who he was every single day. He was quiet. He died in 19. So I can't give him the apology I owe him, which means I have to figure out what version of it I actually have available. Zara signed. The version to switch you change how you run this place. That's the one he'd want. Derek read it. His jaw worked once. He nodded. They sat in the quiet room for another moment, then, "If you're going to be teaching here, I'd like to learn from you. Not as a formality. Actually learn." He looked at her directly. "I've been doing this 15 years, and tonight I watched someone operate at a level I didn't know was in this building. I'd like to understand what I'm missing." She thought about a man sitting in a wheelchair in the cold outside a venue with steps, waiting for someone to notice so he could watch his son's something. She thought about what it meant to spend 15 years turning your father's love into something you were running from. She thought about the park this morning, the footwork coming back before she'd finished giving it permission. She signed, then be in the room. He read it. Okay. He stood, extended his hand. She took it. Rose. They shook hands the way people shake hands after something real, not the measuring grip from last night. Just 2 people who had been through something together and were both still standing. He left. She felt the front door close through the air pressure of the room. Owen found her still on the edge of the mat, keys in hand, coat over his arm. He stopped and tilted his head in the mild way he had. She signed. 5 more minutes. He signed. Back careful with it. Take your time. He went to finish locking up, and then she was alone in Ironside at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday night with the lights dimmed and the floor empty and 21 years of other people's effort absorbed into every surface. She put her hands flat on the mat, felt the texture of it. The give. The smells rising from the rubber, the same smell from every training floor she'd ever worked on in 11 years across 4 continents. The smell that didn't change, that traveled across years and distances and arrived identical, like a letter in a language that doesn't need to evolve because it was built right the first time. She took the card from her pocket. Dr. Patricia Owens turned it over. Plain white back. She thought about the athlete Dr. Owens had described. Young and talented and navigating the specific exhausting labyrinth of being exceptional at some things while also being the person everyone in every room looked at sideways. She knew what it was to be that person. She knew what it was to look around and not see herself reflected in anyone with authority. Not see proof that the ceiling was navigable rather than fixed. She put the card back in her pocket. She would call, not tomorrow. Some decisions deserved more than the night immediately after. Deserved to be slept on and woken up with and carried through an ordinary morning first. But she would call. She stood, picked up the gym bag, walked to the front door and out into the Atlanta night, which was warm and moving with the low frequency of a city that didn't fully stop at any hour. She walked home. The apartment was the same as she'd left it. She stood in the kitchen and drank a glass of water and looked at Jade on the refrigerator, both of them. On that beach. Both of them grinning like they'd already won everything there was to win. She said out loud, in the rough voice that was still finding its range, "I fought tonight. I think it was right." She looked at Jade. "You kept trying to tell me. Some things are worth keeping still for. I think I finally understand what you meant. Not keeping still in the grief, in the work, in what I actually am." She paused. "I'm going to teach, and I'm not going to be quiet about it." She touched the edge of the photograph. Then she went to the bedroom, pulled the wooden box from under the bed, and opened it. The metal caught the lamplight and held it. She carried it to the wall opposite the bed. The nail that had been there since she moved in, waiting for something she'd decided on. She hung the metal on it, stepped back and looked at it in the dim room. The ribbon slightly faded. The metal entirely itself. She picked up Jade's photograph from the dresser where it has been sitting face down since she moved in and set it on the nightstand. Next to the hand wraps, next to the notebook, the metal on the wall, Jade beside the bed, everything that mattered in one place. Not hidden, not managed, just there. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened the notebook to the last entry. Read it one final time. Tomorrow. Surprise visit. She doesn't know I'm coming. I want to see her face when she sees me. She put her hand flat on the page. She'd been reading this sentence wrong for 3 years, had been reading it as the thing that didn't happen, the arrival that was interrupted. But that wasn't what the sentence was. The sentence was Jade moving toward her, deliberately and joyfully. The motorcycle and the road and the intention in her direction, Jade choosing freely to be on that road going way, not the stopping, the moving. She closed the notebook, turned off the light, lay back in the dark with the metal on the wall, catching the faint light from the window and holding it, small and steady, not announcing itself. Just there, just itself. Sleep came without negotiation, without the careful management that had been required to reach it for 3 years. The metal on the wall, Jade on the nightstand. And somewhere across the city, Marcus Webb was going to wake up tomorrow and put on his blue hearing aids and come to the dojo where someone was waiting to teach him. Not guide him, teach him. That was enough. That was more than enough.